It was one of those Monday mornings where everything seemed to go wrong from the very start. Judge Amara Williams had been up since 5 in the morning, dealing with a situation that no daughter ever wants to face. Her elderly mother had called her in a panic, confused and disoriented, not remembering where she'd put her medication. Amara had rushed over to her mother's house, found the pills, made sure she was okay, and then realized with a sinking feeling that she was now running 30 minutes behind schedule. The downtown courthouse was already buzzing with activity when she finally pulled into the parking lot. She grabbed her things from the passenger seat, including the black garment bag that held her judicial robe. Normally, she would arrive early, enter through the private judge's entrance at the back of the building, and have plenty of time to settle into her chambers, review her cases, and mentally prepare for the day ahead. But today wasn't normal. Today she was late, flustered, and making decisions on the fly. She decided to enter through the main lobby. It would be faster, she thought. Just get through security, take the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and everything would be fine. She was still a judge, after all. Still the same person who'd spent 15 years on the bench, earning respect and recognition throughout the legal community. What could possibly go wrong? The moment she walked through those heavy glass doors, she felt the chaos. The lobby was packed with people. Lawyers in expensive suits checked their watches impatiently. Defendants sat nervously on benches, some with family members holding their hands. Witnesses clutched folders of documents. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, and everyone seemed stressed. The security checkpoint, which normally moved at a reasonable pace, was backed up with at least 20 people waiting in line. Amara took her place at the end of the line, shifting her garment bag to her other arm. She was wearing a nice pantsuit, professional but not flashy. Without her robe, without the formal trappings of her office, she looked like anyone else in that lobby. Just another black woman waiting her turn, trying to get through her Monday. At the front of the security line, Officer Derek Hutchins was having what appeared to be a terrible morning of his own. He'd been working courthouse security for 15 years, and lately every day felt the same. The same crowds, the same metal detectors beeping, the same people trying to bring prohibited items through the checkpoint. He was tired, bored, and increasingly irritable. His patience, never particularly strong to begin with, was wearing thinner by the minute. Hutchins had a reputation around the courthouse. Some people called him thorough. Others called him aggressive. The truth probably lay somewhere in between, but it definitely leaned toward the latter. He had a way of barking orders at people, of treating everyone who came through that security line like they were already guilty of something. He'd been talked to about it before by supervisors, but nothing ever really changed. A warning here, a conversation there, and then back to business as usual. The line moved slowly. Amara checked her watch and felt her anxiety rising. She had a full docket today, including a complicated case that was supposed to start at 9:30. She needed to be in her chambers, needed to review her notes one more time, needed to be ready. But here she was, stuck in line with everyone else, moving forward one shuffling step at a time. Officer Hutchins's voice carried across the lobby. "Come on, people. Move it along. Empty your pockets before you get to the detector. This isn't rocket science." His tone was sharp, impatient, bordering on hostile. Several people in line exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody said anything. Who wants to argue with security before they even get into the building? Amara finally reached the front of the line. She set her bag and purse on the conveyor belt and stepped toward the metal detector. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her clerk. It was marked urgent, something about a motion that had been filed late last night in one of her cases. She needed to read it, needed to know what she was walking into. That's when Officer Hutchins's attention locked onto her. He saw a woman looking at her phone, not moving through the metal detector fast enough, not following his instructions. In his mind, she was just another person making his job harder. Another person who thought the rules didn't apply to them. "Hey!" His voice was loud enough that people throughout the lobby turned to look. "No phones in the security line. You see the sign? Can you read?" The last question hung in the air, laden with an implication that made Amara's jaw tighten. She looked up at him calmly, though her heart was already starting to beat faster. She'd dealt with men like this before. She knew the tone, knew the attitude, knew exactly what was happening here. "I'm checking a message about court business," she said evenly, her voice professional and clear. "I'm Judge Williams. I preside on the third floor. Officer Hutchins looked at her for a long moment. He didn't see a judge. He saw what he expected to see, what his biases told him he was seeing. A young black woman making excuses, claiming to be something she wasn't, trying to get special treatment. "Sure you are," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the governor." Put the phone away and step through the detector. Now. Amara felt that familiar feeling rising in her chest, the mixture of frustration, anger, and exhaustion that comes from not being believed, from having to prove yourself in situations where others never would. How many times in her life had this happened? How many times had she been underestimated, dismissed, treated as if she didn't belong? "Officer, if you'll just check with your supervisor," she began, keeping her voice steady and professional. "I don't need to check with anybody," Hutchins interrupted. "What I need is for you to follow the rules like everyone else. No special treatment here." The irony wasn't lost on Amara. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was simply trying to identify herself, trying to explain the situation. But in his mind, her very existence in this space, her claim to authority, was somehow an affront to the natural order of things. She took a breath and made a decision. She would step through the metal detector, collect her things, and then speak with the head of security directly. This wasn't worth a scene in the lobby. She had a job to do, cases to hear, people depending on her to be professional and composed. But as she moved to step around Officer Hutchins to walk through the detector, he shifted his position to block her path. The crowd in the lobby had grown quiet now, sensing that something was about to happen. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see how this would unfold. And that's when everything changed. The moment seemed to freeze. Judge Amara Williams stood there looking at Officer Hutchins blocking her path, and she could see exactly what was about to happen. She'd lived through enough experiences like this to recognize the signs. The set of his jaw, the way his hand moved slightly toward his belt, the barely contained anger in his eyes. This wasn't going to end well. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge of authority creeping in. "I need to get through. I have a courtroom full of people waiting for me upstairs." Hutchins let out a laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. It was the kind of sound people make when they think someone is telling them a ridiculous lie. "A courtroom full of people? Lady, the only place you're going is back to the end of that line. And if you keep giving me attitude, you might be going somewhere else entirely. We don't tolerate disrespect here." Disrespect. That word echoed in Amara's mind. She'd been nothing but respectful. Professional, calm, clear in her communication. But somehow her mere presence, her attempt to identify herself, was being interpreted as disrespect. It was a story as old as time, and she was tired of living it. Behind her, she could hear people whispering. Some had pulled out their phones. In this day and age, everyone documented everything. Part of her was grateful for that. At least there would be a record of what happened here. At least she wouldn't be dismissed as exaggerating or being too sensitive. "Officer Hutchins," she tried one more time, emphasizing his name, which she'd seen on his badge. "I understand you're doing your job. I respect that. But I'm telling you the truth. I'm Judge Amara Williams. I've been presiding over cases in this courthouse for 15 years. If you would just call your supervisor." "I'm done listening to this." Hutchins cut her off, his voice rising loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear. "You know what your problem is? You think you can just walk in here, throw around some fake title and get special treatment. Well, that's not how this works. Not on my watch." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Amara instinctively took a step back, her heart now pounding hard in her chest. This was escalating fast, faster than she'd anticipated. She glanced around, looking for someone, anyone who might intervene. Where was the head of security? Where were the other officers who usually worked this checkpoint? "I'm not asking for special treatment," Amara said, and for the first time her voice wavered slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer weight of the injustice of this moment. "I'm simply trying to get to my chambers so I can do my job." "Your chambers," Hutchins repeated mockingly. "Listen to yourself. You really expect me to believe that you, looking like that, coming through the public entrance like everyone else, are a judge? Do I look stupid to you?" There it was. The part that was usually left unsaid now hanging in the air between them. Looking like that. Those 3 words contained everything. All the assumptions, all the prejudice, all the reasons why he couldn't accept what she was telling him. She didn't look like what he thought a judge should look like. She didn't fit his narrow picture of authority and respectability. Amara felt something shift inside her. The part that had been trying to stay calm, to de-escalate, to handle this professionally. That part was struggling against another part that was just angry. Angry at having to prove herself yet again. Angry at being treated this way in her own workplace. Angry at the system that had allowed officers like Hutchins to operate with impunity for so long. "Officer, I'm going to walk around you now," she said, her voice steady again but colder. "I'm going to collect my things and I'm going to go upstairs. And then we're going to have a very serious conversation about what just happened here." She moved to step around him, heading toward where her bag had already passed through the X-ray machine. She wasn't asking permission anymore. She was simply moving forward, asserting her right to be in this space, to do her job, to exist without being questioned at every turn. That's when Officer Hutchins made the worst decision of his career. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, not gently, and pushed her backward. It wasn't a slight touch. It wasn't a guiding gesture. It was a shove, hard enough that Amara stumbled, her feet tangling as she tried to catch her balance. She didn't fall, but it was close. The garment bag slipped from her grip and hit the floor. The lobby went completely silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The security footage would later show that a full 3 seconds passed, where every single person in that space just stood frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. An officer had put his hands on someone, had shoved them, had used physical force against a woman who posed no threat whatsoever. Amara stood there, her shoulder throbbing where he'd grabbed her, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. She'd been shoved, physically assaulted, in the lobby of her own courthouse, by a security officer who was supposed to protect people, not harm them. "You're not going anywhere until you show some proper respect," Hutchins said, his voice hard and cold. His hand moved toward the handcuffs on his belt, a gesture that was both threatening and absurd. Was he seriously thinking about arresting her? A sitting judge? That's when the spell broke. "Oh my God, that's Judge Williams." The voice came from somewhere in the crowd. A young woman, a public defender who'd argued cases in Amara's courtroom dozens of times, was staring with her phone out, recording everything. "That's Judge Williams," someone else echoed. And suddenly there was movement, voices, people rushing forward. The head of security, Tom Rodriguez, came running from his office near the back of the lobby. He'd heard the commotion but hadn't initially understood what was happening. Now, as he pushed through the crowd and saw Judge Williams standing there, saw Officer Hutchins with his hand still hovering near his cuffs, saw the shocked faces of everyone watching, his face went pale. "Officer Hutchins," Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip. "Step back. Step back right now." Hutchins turned, confusion crossing his face. Then he looked back at Amara, really looked at her this time. He saw the way people were reacting, saw the phones recording, saw the horror on Rodriguez's face. And slowly, very slowly, the realization began to dawn on him. "Chief Rodriguez, this woman was being disruptive and—" Hutchins started to explain, but Rodriguez cut him off with a sharp gesture. "That's Judge Williams," Rodriguez said, each word heavy with implication. "That's Judge Amara Williams. She presides over courtroom 3B. The color drained from Hutchins's face. His mouth opened, then closed. His hand dropped away from his belt. He looked at Amara again, and this time she could see the panic setting in behind his eyes, the understanding of what he'd just done, who he'd just shoved, the career-ending mistake he'd just made in front of dozens of witnesses. Amara stood there, watching him process it all. Part of her wanted to say something cutting, something that would capture the irony and injustice of this moment, but she found she didn't have the words. Or maybe she had too many words, and none of them were appropriate for this very public setting. Instead, she bent down, picked up her garment bag, and straightened her jacket. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her, but her voice when she spoke was perfectly steady. "Officer Hutchins," she said quietly, but in the silent lobby everyone heard her. "Chief Rodriguez, I'll see both of you in my chambers in 15 minutes. Don't be late." And with that she walked past them, through the metal detector that nobody tried to stop her from passing through now, collected her purse and bag from the conveyor belt and headed toward the elevators. Her head was high, her spine straight, every inch of her radiating the dignity and authority that came with her position. But inside, she was falling apart. The elevator ride up to the 3rd floor felt like it lasted forever, even though it was only about 40 seconds. Judge Amara Williams stood alone in the small space, watching the numbers light up as she ascended. Second floor. Third floor. The doors opened with a soft ding, and she stepped out into the familiar hallway that led to her chambers. Her clerk, Jennifer, looked up from her desk with a smile that immediately faded when she saw Amara's face. "Judge Williams? Are you okay? You look—" "Cancel my morning docket," Amara said quietly, setting her things down on Jennifer's desk because she didn't trust her hands to carry them any further. "Reschedule everything. I need some time." Jennifer stood up quickly, her eyes scanning Amara with concern. After working together for 7 years, she knew her boss well enough to recognize when something serious had happened. "Of course. Right away. Is there anything I can do?"
"Do you need me to call anyone?"
Amara shook her head. "Just give me 15 minutes. I'm expecting the head of security and one of his officers. When they arrive, send them straight in." She walked into her chambers and closed the door behind her. Only then, with the solid wood between her and the rest of the world, did she let herself breathe. Really breathe. Her hands were still shaking, and now that the adrenaline was wearing off, her shoulder was starting to hurt where Hutchins had grabbed her. She hung up her garment bag and sank into her chair, the same chair she'd sat in thousands of times before. This room had always been her sanctuary. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with law journals and case files, her diplomas and awards on the wall. Evidence of everything she'd accomplished, every barrier she'd broken through, every person who'd told her she couldn't do something that she'd gone ahead and done anyway. Her eyes landed on a framed photograph on her desk. It showed her at her swearing-in ceremony 15 years ago, her mother standing beside her with tears streaming down her face. Her mother, who'd grown up in the segregated South, who'd been denied entry to restaurants and schools and water fountains. Her mother, who'd marched and protested and fought so that her daughter could one day sit behind a bench and render justice. What would her mother say about what just happened downstairs? Actually, Amara knew exactly what she'd say. She'd heard it before many times. "Baby, they're going to test you. They're going to doubt you. They're going to make you prove yourself over and over again. But you hold your head high. You remember who you are, and you never ever let them make you feel small." Amara touched her shoulder gently, wincing at the tenderness. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was assault. An officer of the court had physically put his hands on her, had shoved her, had threatened to arrest her, all because he couldn't accept that a black woman could be a judge. She thought about all the times she'd let smaller incidents slide. The lawyers who spoke over her in court until she had to raise her voice. The colleagues who expressed surprise at her accomplishments, as if they hadn't expected her to be competent. The defendants who asked if she was really the judge, as if she might be playing dress-up in someone else's robe. Each time, she'd chosen to focus on her work, to prove herself through her decisions and her conduct. She'd told herself that making a big deal out of every microaggression would be exhausting, would distract from what really mattered. And that was true, but this wasn't a microaggression. This was a line cross that couldn't be uncrossed. There was a soft knock on her door. "Judge Williams? They're here." Amara straightened in her chair, squared her shoulders, and pushed down everything she was feeling. The fear, the anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of having to deal with this. She could fall apart later. Right now, she needed to be Judge Williams. Send them in. The door opened, and Chief Tom Rodriguez entered first, his face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide his panic. Behind him came Officer Derek Hutchins, who looked like he was walking to his own execution. He couldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere around her desk, his face still pale, his hands clasped in front of him. "Judge Williams," Rodriguez began, his voice careful and measured. "I want to start by apologizing for—" "Sit down," Amara interrupted, gesturing to the 2 chairs across from her desk. Her tone was not unkind, but it left no room for argument. This was her chamber, her domain, and they would follow her lead. They sat. The silence stretched out for a moment as Amara looked at both of them. Rodriguez appeared deeply uncomfortable but composed. Hutchins looked like he might be sick. "Officer Hutchins," Amara said finally, focusing her attention on him. "Look at me, please." Slowly, painfully, Hutchins raised his eyes to meet hers. She could see genuine fear there, but she couldn't yet tell if it was fear of consequences or genuine understanding of what he'd done. "I want you to tell me, in your own words, what happened downstairs just now." Hutchins swallowed hard. When he spoke, his voice was rough, shaky. "Judge Williams, I made a terrible mistake. I didn't realize who you were, and you didn't realize who I was. Amara repeated slowly. So the question is, if you had realized who I was, would you have treated me differently? The question hung in the air. Rodriguez shifted in his seat. Hutchins opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Yes, of course. You're a judge. You have authority here. I see, Amara said softly. So it's the title that matters to you. The position, not the person, not their dignity, not their right to be treated with basic respect. Just the title. Hutchins looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why that would be a problem. I was doing my job. Security protocols exist for everyone. Now, did you shove me? Amara asked directly, cutting through whatever justification he was about to offer. Silence. Then, barely audible, yes. Did I pose any physical threat to you or anyone else in that lobby? No, but you were being disrespectful. Was I? Amara leaned forward slightly. I told you who I was. I explained I was checking an urgent message about court business. I asked you to verify my identity with your supervisor. Which part of that was disrespectful? Hutchins had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but it wasn't one he could say out loud. Not here, not to her face. The answer was that her very existence in that space, her claim to authority, her refusal to be cowed by his aggression, that's what he'd found disrespectful. Let me ask you a different question, Amara continued, her voice still calm but with an edge like steel. If I had been a white woman in a business suit, would you have shoved me? The question landed like a physical blow. Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly. Hutchins's face flushed red and he looked away again. The silence was answer enough. Judge Williams, Rodriguez spoke up, his voice heavy with the weight of liability and lawsuits and public relations nightmares. I assure you that we take this matter very seriously. Officer Hutchins will be immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Will he? Amara asked, turning her attention to the chief. Because I've been doing some thinking in the last 15 minutes. I've been thinking about how many times something like this might have happened before. How many other people without titles, without authority, without witnesses, might have been treated this way by Officer Hutchins and had nowhere to turn. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. If there have been other complaints, have there been? Amara asked directly. Other complaints? Other incidents? The pause before Rodriguez answered told her everything she needed to know. There have been some concerns raised, but nothing that rose to the level of assaulting a judge, Amara finished for him. Nothing that mattered enough to take action. Until now. Until it happened to someone who couldn't be ignored. She stood up from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. People were going about their lives, completely unaware of what had happened in the courthouse lobby this morning. Completely unaware of how quickly things could turn dangerous. How fragile the line was between order and chaos. I want all of Officer Hutchins's personnel files, she said, still looking out the window. Every complaint, every incident report, every performance review for the last 5 years. I want body camera footage from this morning if it exists. I want witness statements from everyone who was in that lobby. And I want a full report on my desk by end of business tomorrow. Of course, Rodriguez said quickly. Absolutely. Whatever you need. Amara turned back to face them. And Officer Hutchins, you're going to think very carefully about what happened this morning. Not about the fact that you shoved a judge. About the fact that you shoved a person who was doing nothing wrong, who posed no threat, who deserved the same respect you'd give to anyone else. That's what you need to think about. Hutchins nodded mutely, his eyes glossy with tears he was trying hard to hold back. You can go now, Amara said quietly. Both of you. They stood and moved toward the door. Rodriguez left quickly, clearly eager to start damage control. Hutchins paused at the doorway, turned back. Judge Williams, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Amara looked at him for a long moment. The apology sounded sincere, or at least more sincere than it had earlier. But sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't undo what happened. Sorry didn't protect the next person who might not have a title to shield them. By late afternoon, Judge Amara Williams had reviewed 73 pages of documents that Jennifer had quietly gathered. Personnel files, incident reports, complaint forms that had been filed and mysteriously dismissed. She sat in her chambers as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the papers spread before her, and felt her anger building with each page she read. This wasn't Officer Derek Hutchins's first incident. Not even close. 3 years ago, a black attorney had complained that Hutchins made him empty his briefcase completely, while white attorneys walked through with just a cursory check. The complaint was dismissed as a misunderstanding. 2 years ago, a Hispanic woman claimed Hutchins had made inappropriate comments about her appearance and questioned whether she was really there for court or for some other reason. That complaint resulted in a verbal warning. Last year, an elderly black man with a cane had been detained for 20 minutes because Hutchins didn't believe he was a retired judge coming to observe proceedings. The pattern was clear, crystal clear, and yet nothing had really been done. A warning here, a conversation there, maybe a day or two of retraining. But Hutchins had always kept his job, always come back to that security checkpoint, always continued treating certain people like they didn't belong. Amara closed the last file and sat back in her chair. She thought about all those people who'd complained before. People who didn't have her platform, her position, her ability to make noise that couldn't be ignored. They'd spoken up and they'd been dismissed. Their experiences had been minimized, written off as misunderstandings or oversensitivity. And she thought about all the people who hadn't complained at all. The ones who'd swallowed their anger and humiliation because they knew it wouldn't make a difference, because they couldn't afford to make waves, because they had pending cases and couldn't risk antagonizing courthouse security. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "Baby, I just saw the news." Her mother's voice came through, worried and fierce at the same time. "Someone sent me a video." "Are you okay? Did that man really put his hands on you?" "I'm okay, Mama," Amara said and realized it was half true. She was physically okay. Emotionally was another story. "You're not okay. I can hear it in your voice. I'm coming down there." "Mama, no! I'm handling this. I promise." Amara stood and walked to her window again, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. "But can I ask you something? Do you remember when you used to tell me about the sit-ins? About the protests?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Of course I remember. Why?" "You always said the hardest part wasn't the violence or the arrests. It was the exhaustion, the constant having to prove you deserved basic dignity, having to be perfect all the time because any mistake would be used against your whole community." Amara's voice caught slightly. "I'm so tired, Mama. I'm so tired of this." "I know, baby. I know." Her mother's voice was soft, full of understanding that spanned generations. "But you listen to me. What happened to you today? That wasn't your fault. That wasn't because you did anything wrong. That was about him and his hate and his fear. You hear me? I hear you. And you're going to do what you always do. You're going to handle this with grace and strength. But you're also going to take care of yourself. Promise me." After they hung up, Amara sat in the growing darkness of her chambers for a while. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat there thinking about what came next. She could file a formal complaint. She would file a formal complaint. But she knew how these things often went. Hutchins would be suspended, maybe even fired if the public pressure was strong enough. There would be promises of better training, new protocols, renewed commitment to equality. And then, slowly, things would drift back to how they were before. The outrage would fade. The news cycle would move on. And the fundamental problems that allowed someone like Hutchins to operate for so long would remain, unless she did something more, unless she used this moment, as painful as it was, to push for real change. Her phone buzzed with a text from Judge Patterson, her colleague from down the hall. "Amara, whatever you need, I've got your back. So do the other judges. We all saw the video. This is unacceptable." It was a kind message, genuinely kind. But it also reminded her of something that had been nagging at her all day. Where had all this support been for the people who complained before? When the attorney was forced to empty his briefcase, when the woman faced inappropriate comments, when the retired judge was detained, where were the other judges then? Where were the allies when it would have actually cost them something to speak up? She texted back a simple thank you, then set her phone aside. There was a knock on her door. "Come in," she called out. Jennifer entered with a concerned look. "Judge, I know you said you wanted to be left alone, but there's someone here who insists on seeing you. She says it's important." "Who is it?" "Kelly Davis. She's a public defender. She says she was in the lobby this morning." Amara nodded. "Send her in." A young woman entered, probably in her late 20s, with nervous energy and a phone clutched in her hand. "Judge Williams, I'm so sorry to bother you. I needed to tell you that I recorded everything. The whole thing. And I've already been contacted by 3 news stations wanting the footage. Have you given it to them? Amara asked. No, not yet. I wanted to ask you first. I know this is deeply personal, and I didn't want to make things worse for you by spreading the video without your consent. But I also think people need to see what happened. They need to see how Officer Hutchins treated you. Amara studied the young woman. She could tell Kelly was genuinely conflicted, trying to do the right thing. What's your instinct telling you to do? Kelly hesitated. Honestly, I think it needs to be public. Because this isn't just about you. I've seen Hutchins treat people badly before. I've watched him profile defendants, make assumptions, abuse his little bit of power. But he always got away with it because his victims were people the system already doesn't take seriously. Drug defendants, people with warrants, people who look like they don't belong in a courthouse unless they're in handcuffs. And you think me being a judge changes that calculus? Amara asked. I think it makes people pay attention, Kelly said carefully. I think it makes it impossible to sweep under the rug. And I think if we don't use this moment to shine a light on the bigger problem, we're wasting an opportunity to protect a lot of vulnerable people. Amara considered this. The young public defender was right, of course. The video going public would be uncomfortable, embarrassing even. It would mean her humiliation was broadcast for everyone to see, but it would also create pressure for real change. Release it, Amara decided. But I want you to do something for me. I want you to tell the news stations about the other incidents, about the other complaints against Officer Hutchins, about the pattern of behavior that was ignored. This isn't just about what happened to me today. It's about a system that failed to protect people long before I walked through that lobby. Kelly nodded eagerly. I can do that. Thank you, Judge Williams. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you. You've always been fair to my clients. You actually listen. We need more judges like you. After Kelly left, Amara finally turned on the lights in her chambers. The room flooded with warm illumination, chasing away the shadows. She looked around at her books, her diplomas, her awards, all the markers of success, of achievement, of breaking through barriers. But none of it had protected her from what happened this morning. None of it had made Officer Hutchins see her as a human being deserving of respect. Her phone rang again. This time it was Chief Rodriguez. Judge Williams, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've completed preliminary interviews and— Save it, Amara interrupted, her voice cold. I've spent the afternoon reading through Officer Hutchins' file. I've read every complaint, every incident, every slap on the wrist he's received over the years. Do you want to explain to me why this man was still working security? Rodriguez was silent for a long moment. Judge, I understand your anger. Do you? Amara asked sharply. Do you really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your department has spent years ignoring complaints about this officer, because the people complaining didn't have enough power to make you care. It looks like you've prioritized protecting your officer over protecting the public he's supposed to serve. That's not fair, Rodriguez protested weakly. Fair? Amara's voice rose. Let me tell you what's not fair. What's not fair is the attorney who was humiliated at that security checkpoint and had his complaint dismissed. What's not fair is the woman who was objectified and made to feel unsafe and got nothing but a meaningless verbal warning for her trouble. What's not fair is that it took an officer putting his hands on a judge before anyone decided this was a problem, worth actually addressing. She took a breath, forcing herself to calm down. Losing her temper wouldn't help anything. Here's what's going to happen, she continued, her voice steady again but firm. You're going to conduct a real investigation. Not the kind where you interview Hutchins and his buddies and call it thorough. A real investigation with outside oversight. And I'm going to file a formal complaint that will go on his permanent record, plus. 3 days after the incident, Judge Amara Williams sat in a conference room with representatives from the courthouse administration, the local bar association, and an independent civil rights attorney who'd been brought in to oversee the investigation. The video from Kelly Davis's phone had done exactly what Amara had expected it would do. It had exploded across social media and local news, sparking outrage and demanding action. But what happened behind closed doors was often more complicated than what played out in public. The civil rights attorney, Patricia Chen, had spent the last 72 hours conducting interviews and reviewing records. She was thorough, professional, and clearly took her job seriously. Amara appreciated that, even as she braced herself for what was coming. Judge Williams, Patricia began, spreading several folders across the conference table. I've completed my preliminary investigation and I need to be honest with you. What I've found is deeply troubling. She opened the first folder. Officer Derek Hutchins has been employed by courthouse security for 15 years. In that time, there have been 17 formal complaints filed against him. 17. And that's not counting the informal complaints that were never officially documented. 17. The number hung in the air like an accusation against everyone who'd allowed this to continue. Patricia continued, flipping through pages. The complaints follow a clear pattern. 15 of the 17 complainants are people of color. The incidents range from unnecessary searches and aggressive questioning to inappropriate comments and, in 2 previous cases, minor physical contact that wasn't quite aggressive enough to result in formal charges. Minor physical contact, Amara repeated, her voice tight. What does that mean? In one case, Hutchins grabbed a defendant's arm hard enough to leave bruises when escorting him out of the building. The complaint was dismissed because the defendant had been verbally aggressive. In another case, he blocked a woman's path similar to what happened with you, though there was no shove. She was intimidated enough to file a complaint, but it was categorized as a miscommunication. Amara felt her hands clenching under the table. And what actions were taken after these complaints? Patricia's expression was grim. Minimal. One suspension that lasted 3 days. Several verbal warnings that weren't documented in his permanent file. Mandatory retraining that consisted of watching a 4-hour video on professional conduct. And in 6 cases, the complaints were dismissed entirely without any disciplinary action. Why? Amara asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. The pattern I've identified suggests that complaints from defendants, particularly those with criminal records, were given less weight. The reasoning documented in the files suggests that these individuals lacked credibility. As for the other complaints, they were generally dismissed as misunderstandings or differences in perception about what constituted appropriate security measures. One of the courthouse administrators, a woman named Ruth who'd been with the system for 20 years, spoke up defensively. We have to be careful about taking every complaint at face value. Security officers deal with difficult people every day. Sometimes defendants or their families become confrontational, and officers need to maintain control of the situation. Amara turned her gaze to Ruth, and the woman visibly shrank back. Ruth, I've read every one of those complaints. Not one of them describes a situation where Officer Hutchins was in actual danger, or where his actions were proportionate to any genuine threat. What I see is a man who profiled people based on their appearance and treated them accordingly. Patricia nodded. That's consistent with my findings. Additionally, I've discovered that Officer Hutchins' supervisor at the time of most of these complaints was someone who retired 2 years ago. In his exit interview, he actually noted concerns about Hutchins's behavior, but stated he didn't feel he could do much about it, because Hutchins had friends in the union, and any significant discipline would result in a grievance. So he was protected, Amara said quietly. He was allowed to continue mistreating people because it was easier than dealing with the political headache of holding him accountable. The room fell silent. No one wanted to confirm what everyone knew was true, but the evidence was overwhelming. Patricia pulled out another folder. Now, regarding the incident with you, Judge Williams, I've obtained the security camera footage from the lobby. It corroborates everything in the public defender's video. Officer Hutchins was aggressive from the start, dismissed your attempts to identify yourself, and physically shoved you with enough force that you nearly fell. In any reasonable assessment, this constitutes assault. Have charges been filed? Asked someone from the administration. That's up to Judge Williams, Patricia said, looking at Amara. She has every right to press criminal charges. However, I should note that Officer Hutchins has hired an attorney, and they've already begun crafting a defense. Amara raised an eyebrow. A defense? What possible defense could he offer? Patricia looked uncomfortable. His attorney is arguing that this was a case of mistaken identity and excessive force in the performance of duty, not a criminal assault. They're claiming that you weren't wearing your judicial robe, entered through the public entrance, and didn't present proper identification when requested. They're suggesting that while Officer Hutchins may have been overzealous, his actions don't rise to the level of criminal conduct. The audacity of it took Amara's breath away. They were actually going to try to blame her for what happened. For not looking like what Hutchins thought a judge should look like. For not carrying some special card or badge that would have satisfied him. For having the nerve to enter her own workplace through the wrong door. That's absurd, Ruth protested, finally showing some spine. Judge Williams clearly identified herself multiple times. That's in the video. Yes, but his attorney will argue that anyone can claim to be a judge. They'll say Hutchins had no way to verify her identity in the moment and was following security protocols by not taking her claim at face value. Amara leaned back in her chair, processing this. So they're going to turn this into a story about an officer just doing his job, and a judge who got offended because she expected special treatment. That appears to be their strategy, Patricia confirmed. And I'll be honest with you, Judge Williams, it might be effective with some people. There are those who will see the video and focus on the fact that you didn't have visible identification, rather than on the excessive force used against you. Because that's easier, Amara said softly. It's easier to blame the victim for not doing enough to prevent their own mistreatment than to confront the system that enabled that mistreatment. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse grounds. People were coming and going, pursuing justice or fleeing from it, all unaware of the conversation happening in this room. Let me ask you something, Amara said without turning around. If I had been a white male judge in the same situation, late, stressed, entering through the public entrance without my robe, do you honestly believe Officer Hutchins would have treated me the same way? The silence that followed was its own answer. Patricia was the one who finally spoke. No. Based on the pattern of complaints and my interviews with witnesses, I don't believe he would have. I believe Officer Hutchins operates with a set of assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces and who doesn't. And those assumptions are influenced by race. Can you prove that? Asked one of the administrators. Can you prove racial bias in a way that would hold up legally? Proving intent is always difficult, Patricia admitted. But the pattern is clear enough that a reasonable person could conclude racial bias played a role. The question is whether we need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt for a criminal conviction, or whether the preponderance of evidence is enough for administrative action. Amara turned back to face the room. I'm not interested in criminal charges. Everyone looked surprised. Patricia leaned forward. Judge Williams, you'd have a strong case. What he did was assault. I know what it was, Amara said firmly. But I'm not interested in making Officer Hutchins into a martyr for people who want to believe this is about political correctness run amok. I'm not interested in a trial that becomes a media circus and overshadows the real issue. What I'm interested in is making sure this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone else. She returned to her seat and looked at each person in the room. Here's what I want. Officer Hutchins needs to be terminated. Not suspended. Not given another chance after more training. Terminated. His pattern of behavior makes it clear he's not suitable for a position that requires impartiality and professionalism. The union will fight that, Ruth warned. Let them fight, Amara said. We have 17 complaints, a video of him assaulting a judge and a clear pattern of racial bias. If the union wants to go to bat for someone like that, they can deal with the public relations nightmare that comes with it. She pulled out a document she'd been working on. Beyond that, I want comprehensive reforms to how security operates in this courthouse. Mandatory bias training that's actually meaningful, not just checking a box. A civilian oversight committee to review complaints. Clear consequences for officers who violate protocols. The following Wednesday morning, Judge Amara Williams walked into her courtroom for the first time since the incident. She'd taken a few days to handle the administrative fallout, to meet with investigators, to draft formal complaints and reform proposals. But now it was time to return to the work she was appointed to do, dispensing justice. Her bailiff, Robert, a 20-year veteran who'd seen just about everything in his time at the courthouse, gave her a supportive nod as she entered through her private door. Good to have you back, Your Honor. Good to be back, Amara replied, settling into her chair behind the bench. She looked out at the courtroom, which was already filling up with lawyers, defendants, family members, and the usual assortment of people whose lives intersected with the criminal justice system on any given day. What she didn't know, what nobody had thought to tell her in the chaos of the past few days, was that Officer Derek Hutchins was scheduled to testify that morning in a case on her docket. Jennifer, her clerk, approached the bench with the morning's files. Your Honor, I need to mention something before we start. What is it? Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. The state versus Michael Torres. The officer who made the arrest is Hutchins. He's scheduled to testify this morning. The defense attorney just filed a motion to exclude his testimony or alternatively, to have you recuse yourself from the case. Amara felt her stomach drop. Of course this would happen. The universe had a twisted sense of timing. When was this motion filed? She asked, keeping her voice neutral even as her mind raced. An hour ago. The defense attorney, Mr. Gonzalez, said he just found out about the incident and realized the connection. He's arguing that your history with Officer Hutchins creates an appearance of bias that would taint any ruling you make regarding his testimony. Amara took a deep breath. This was exactly the kind of complication she'd hoped to avoid. But the law was the law, and she had to follow it regardless of how inconvenient or uncomfortable it might be. Tell Mr. Gonzalez I'll hear his motion first thing, she said, and call the prosecutor too. They'll want to respond. 10 minutes later, her courtroom was packed. News of the motion had spread quickly, and several reporters had managed to squeeze into the public gallery. Everyone wanted to see how Judge Williams would handle coming face-to-face with the officer who'd assaulted her. All rise, Robert announced, though Amara was already seated. The formality of it helped, gave structure to a situation that felt anything but structured. Defense attorney James Gonzalez stood. He was in his 40s, experienced and sharp, the kind of lawyer who knew how to play the angles. Your Honor, thank you for hearing this motion on short notice. As you're aware, my client is charged with possession of a controlled substance. The only evidence of this alleged crime comes from Officer Derek Hutchins, who claims he observed my client engaging in a hand-to-hand transaction in a parking lot. He paused for effect. Officer Hutchins is the same officer who less than a week ago physically assaulted you in the courthouse lobby, an incident that was captured on video and has resulted in his termination from employment. Given this history, I'm moving to exclude Officer Hutchins's testimony entirely on grounds of credibility, or alternatively, requesting that you recuse yourself from this case to avoid any appearance of bias. The prosecutor, Lisa Martinez, was already on her feet before Gonzalez finished. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to manipulate the system. Officer Hutchins's personal conduct in an unrelated incident has no bearing on his observations in this case, which occurred 3 months before the incident in the lobby. The defense is trying to use your unfortunate experience to get his client off on a technicality. Amara listened to both attorneys, then looked down at the file in front of her. State versus Torres, simple possession case. The defendant, a young man in his early 20s, sat at the defense table looking nervous. He probably had no idea his case was about to become a test of judicial ethics and procedure. Mr. Gonzalez, Amara began, her voice measured and professional. I appreciate your concern about the appearance of bias. However, let me be clear about something. My personal experience with Officer Hutchins does not automatically disqualify me from hearing cases where he's a witness. Judges are expected to be impartial, but we're also expected to be able to set aside personal feelings and rule based on evidence and law. Gonzalez nodded respectfully. I understand that, Your Honor, but with respect, the assault on you demonstrates a pattern of behavior that's relevant to Officer Hutchins's credibility. If he's willing to physically assault a judge, what else is he capable of? And how can we trust his testimony in any case? It was a fair point, actually. Amara had to acknowledge that. Ms. Martinez, what's the state's position on the credibility issue? The prosecutor looked frustrated. Your Honor, Officer Hutchins's behavior in the lobby was reprehensible and he's rightfully being held accountable for it. But that doesn't mean he lied about what he saw 3 months ago in a parking lot. The defense can certainly cross-examine him about his termination and use it to attack his credibility. That's their right, but excluding his testimony entirely would set a dangerous precedent. Amara sat back in her chair thinking. This was exactly the kind of situation that made judging difficult. There was no clear right answer, just competing interests and principles that had to be balanced. Here's my ruling, she said finally. Mr. Gonzalez, I'm denying your motion to exclude Officer Hutchins's testimony. The incident in the lobby, while serious, doesn't automatically render him incompetent to testify about events that occurred before that incident. However, you're absolutely free to cross-examine him vigorously about his termination, his pattern of complaints, and anything else relevant to his credibility. Gonzalez nodded, clearly expecting this ruling. As for recusal, Amara continued, that's a closer question. I've spent considerable time reflecting on whether I can be fair and impartial in a case involving Officer Hutchins. and I've concluded that I cannot." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lisa Martinez looked shocked. "Your Honor," Amara held up her hand. "Let me finish. I'm recusing myself not because I believe I would be biased against Officer Hutchins. Frankly, I think I could set aside my personal feelings and evaluate his testimony fairly, but the appearance of impropriety is important. If I rule against the state in this case, people will say it's because I'm biased against Hutchins. If I rule against the defense, people will say I'm overcompensating to appear fair. Either way, the integrity of the verdict would be questioned." She looked at the defendant, Michael Torres, who was watching her with wide eyes. "Mr. Torres, you deserve a trial where the verdict is based purely on the evidence, not colored by extraneous circumstances. I can't give you that, so I'm recusing myself." Gonzalez stood again. "Thank you, Your Honor, that's the right decision. However," Amara continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "let me be very clear about something, Mr. Gonzalez. While I'm recusing myself from this specific case, I'm not recusing myself from all cases involving Officer Hutchins. I've reviewed my docket, and there are 4 other cases where he's listed as a potential witness. In those cases, his testimony is corroborated by other officers or by physical evidence. I see no reason to recuse myself from those matters." She shifted her gaze to include everyone in the courtroom. "What happened between me and Officer Hutchins in the lobby was wrong. It was an abuse of power. It was probably motivated by racial bias, and it resulted in his termination. But I took an oath to uphold the law fairly and impartially. That means not letting my personal experiences cloud my judgment. It also means not allowing defense attorneys to use my experience as a blanket excuse to throw out otherwise valid cases." Amara gathered the files on her bench. "This case will be reassigned to Judge Mitchell. He has an opening on his docket next week. We're adjourned." As the courtroom cleared out, Amara sat alone for a moment. She'd made the right decision, she was certain of that. But it still felt like a loss somehow, like Officer Hutchins was still managing to disrupt her work even after being fired. Robert approached the bench quietly. "That took guts, Your Honor. The easy thing would have been to hear the case and show everyone you could be fair. But you did the harder thing." "The right thing isn't always the easy thing," Amara replied. Later that afternoon, Amara was in her chambers when Jennifer knocked and entered with a worried expression. "Your Honor, there's a situation developing. Officer Hutchins is here. He's in the lobby and he's asking to speak with you." Amara felt her pulse quicken. "Is he alone?" "No, he has his attorney with him. And Chief Rodriguez is there too. They're saying it's urgent." Every instinct told Amara to refuse. She had no obligation to meet with Hutchins, especially not after what he'd done. But curiosity won out. "Show them to the small conference room. I'll be there in 5 minutes." She took those 5 minutes to compose herself, to put on her professional armor, to remember that she was Judge Williams and this was her courthouse. Then she walked to the conference room with her head high. Hutchins looked terrible. He'd aged 10 years in the past week. His eyes were bloodshot, his face haggard. He stood when she entered but couldn't quite meet her gaze. 6 weeks after the incident, Judge Amara Williams sat in a packed auditorium at the County Administration Building. The final report from the independent investigation had been completed, and today was the public hearing where recommendations would be presented and decisions would be announced. The room was filled with an interesting mix of people. Court staff and judges sat in the front rows. Behind them were members of the public, including several of the people who'd filed complaints against Officer Hutchins over the years. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready, and in the back, looking small and defeated, sat Derek Hutchins himself with his attorney. The county administrator, Margaret Foster, called the meeting to order. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd seen her share of controversies over the years, but this one had clearly gotten under her skin. "Good afternoon, everyone. We're here today to present the findings of the independent investigation into the incident involving Judge Amara Williams and former Officer Derek Hutchins, as well as to announce policy changes that will be implemented across all county courthouse facilities." She gestured to Patricia Chen, the civil rights attorney who'd led the investigation. "Ms. Chen has prepared a comprehensive report." "Patricia?" Patricia stood and approached the podium with a thick binder. "Thank you. Over the past 6 weeks, my team has conducted 73 interviews, reviewed 15 years of personnel records, analyzed security footage from multiple incidents, and examined policies and procedures across 3 courthouse locations. What we found paints a troubling picture." She clicked a remote and a slide appeared on the screen behind her showing statistics. Officer Derek Hutchins received 17 formal complaints during his 15-year tenure. But what's more concerning is that our investigation uncovered an additional 23 informal complaints that were never officially documented. These were instances where people complained to supervisors or other staff members, but were discouraged from filing formal paperwork. Murmurs rippled through the audience. 40 complaints total. 40 instances where someone felt mistreated enough to speak up. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we found evidence of a departmental culture that prioritized order and efficiency over fairness and accountability. Officers were evaluated primarily on how quickly they processed people through security and how few incidents occurred on their watch. There were no metrics for respectful treatment, no systems for tracking disparate impact, no meaningful consequences for officers who received multiple complaints. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a breakdown by race of people who'd filed complaints. The disparity was stark. Nearly 80% of complaints came from people of color, despite them representing only about 40% of courthouse visitors. This pattern strongly suggests systemic bias in how security protocols were applied. Our interviews with courthouse staff and visitors confirmed this. Multiple witnesses described observing officers, including but not limited to Officer Hutchins, treating people differently based on their appearance. Margaret Foster leaned forward. Ms. Chen, in your professional opinion, was Officer Hutchins an isolated problem, or was he symptomatic of larger issues? Patricia didn't hesitate. Both. Officer Hutchins clearly had personal biases and behavioral problems that made him particularly unsuitable for his position. But he was able to operate for 15 years because the system enabled him. Poor training, inadequate oversight, a culture that dismissed complaints, and a union that protected officers regardless of misconduct all contributed to the problem. She moved to the next section of her presentation. Regarding the specific incident with Judge Williams, our findings are unambiguous. Officer Hutchins used excessive and unwarranted force against someone who posed no threat and who had properly identified herself. His actions constitute assault. Additionally, we found evidence that racial bias played a significant role in how he perceived and responded to Judge Williams. How can you prove racial bias? Someone called out from the audience. Patricia turned to address the question. We conducted psychological testing as part of the investigation. Officer Hutchins voluntarily participated. The testing revealed significant implicit bias against people of color, particularly in high-stress situations. Combined with his pattern of complaints, witness statements, and his own admissions during therapy, we have a preponderance of evidence that racial bias influenced his behavior. She paused, letting that sink in. I want to be clear. This doesn't make Officer Hutchins a monster. Implicit bias is something most people struggle with. But when you're in a position of authority, when you have the power to detain, search, or even arrest people, you have a responsibility to recognize and manage your biases. Officer Hutchins failed to do that, and the department failed to provide him with the tools or accountability to change. Margaret Foster nodded. Thank you, Ms. Chen. Now let's move to the recommendations and consequences. She pulled out a document and began reading. Effective immediately, Derek Hutchins's termination from county employment is finalized. His appeal through the union has been denied based on the findings of this investigation. Additionally, Mr. Hutchins will be placed on a registry that prevents him from being rehired in any security or law enforcement capacity within the county. There was a small commotion in the back where Hutchins sat. His attorney whispered something to him, but Hutchins just stared straight ahead, his face blank. Furthermore, Margaret continued, the following policy changes will be implemented within 90 days across all courthouse security operations. She clicked through slides as she spoke. First, mandatory comprehensive bias training for all security personnel, to be conducted quarterly rather than annually. This training will be developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and will include scenario-based exercises and ongoing evaluation. Second, establishment of a civilian oversight committee with the authority to review all security-related complaints and recommend disciplinary action. This committee will include community members, attorneys, and court staff, and will meet monthly. Third, implementation of body cameras for all security personnel, with footage to be retained for a minimum of 90 days and made available for review in response to complaints. Fourth, Revision of evaluation criteria for security officers to include metrics on respectful treatment, complaint resolution, and community feedback. Officers who receive multiple complaints will be subject to mandatory retraining or reassignment. Fifth, creation of a streamlined complaint process with multiple reporting options, including anonymous submissions. All complaints will be tracked in a central database and analyzed quarterly for patterns. Amara listened to each point with a mixture of satisfaction and skepticism. These were good policies, strong policies. But she'd been in the system long enough to know that policies on paper didn't always translate to change in practice. Implementation would be everything. Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. I know some of you may be thinking that these are just words, just promises. I want to assure you that we're committed to real, sustained change. We're allocating $200,000 in the next budget cycle specifically for these reforms. We're hiring a full-time coordinator to oversee implementation, and we're committing to transparency, with quarterly public reports on our progress. She looked directly at Amara. Judge Williams, you brought this issue to light through your courage in speaking up when you could have simply moved on. The reforms we're implementing today are a direct result of your advocacy. On behalf of the county, I want to thank you for holding us accountable. The room burst into applause. Amara felt herself getting emotional but forced herself to maintain composure. This wasn't about her. It was about all the people who'd been mistreated before her, and all the people who would hopefully be protected going forward. When the applause died down, Margaret opened the floor for public comment. Several people stood to speak. A young black man approached the microphone. My name is Jerome Washington. 5 years ago, Officer Hutchins stopped me in the courthouse lobby and searched my bag even though I'd just come through the metal detector. He said I looked suspicious. I filed a complaint, but nothing happened. I want to say thank you to Judge Williams for making sure that this time, something actually changed. An older Latina woman spoke next. I'm Rosa Mendez. 3 years ago, Officer Hutchins made me wait at security for 20 minutes while he called to verify that I was actually a witness in a trial. He didn't believe that I could be a witness because of how I was dressed. I didn't file a complaint because I didn't think anyone would care. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. One after another, people shared their stories. Some had filed complaints that went nowhere. Others had stayed silent, assuming nothing would change. Each story added weight to what Amara already knew. This problem had been going on for years, affecting countless people who just wanted to access the courthouse without being humiliated. Then, unexpectedly, Officer Hutchins himself stood and approached the microphone. The room went silent. His attorney tried to pull him back, but Hutchins shook him off. My name is Derek Hutchins, he said, his voice trembling. I'm the reason we're all here today. 4 months had passed since that Monday morning when everything changed. Judge Amara Williams stood backstage at the National Association of Women Judges Conference, waiting to be introduced for her keynote speech. She'd been invited to talk about her experience, about the incident and its aftermath, about what it meant to seek justice when you yourself had been wronged. She'd almost declined the invitation. The thought of standing in front of hundreds of people and reliving that day, of making her pain public yet again, was exhausting. But her mother had convinced her otherwise. Baby, your story isn't just your story anymore, her mother had said. It belongs to everyone who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or made to feel like they don't belong. You tell it not for yourself, but for them. So here she was, smoothing down her dress and taking deep breaths while the conference organizer gave her introduction. And now, please welcome Judge Amara Williams. The applause was warm and sustained. Amara walked onto the stage, took her place behind the podium, and looked out at the sea of faces. Judges from across the country, women who'd fought their own battles to reach the bench, who understood in their bones what it meant to have to prove yourself over and over again. Thank you, she began. When I was first invited to speak today, I wasn't sure I had anything valuable to say. After all, what happened to me isn't unique. It's a story that plays out every day in courthouses and offices and stores, in every space where some people are presumed to belong and others are constantly questioned. She clicked to the first slide, which showed the security checkpoint at her courthouse. This is where it happened, a place I'd walked through hundreds of times before, a place that should have been routine, unremarkable, but on that particular morning I was running late. I wasn't wearing my robe. I entered through the public entrance instead of the judge's entrance, and suddenly I didn't look like what someone expected a judge to look like. The room was absolutely silent. Everyone knew the story, had seen the video, but hearing her tell it in her own words gave it new weight. I was shoved, physically assaulted by a security officer who couldn't believe that someone who looked like me could hold the title I held. And in that moment I had a choice. I could brush it off, minimize it, try to move past it quickly and quietly. Or I could speak up, knowing that doing so would make my humiliation public, would invite scrutiny and criticism, would turn a painful personal experience into a political statement. She paused, taking a sip of water. I chose to speak up, not because I'm particularly brave or because I wanted the attention. I spoke up because I realized that my silence would protect a system that had failed many people before me. A system that treated complaints from marginalized people as less credible, less important, less worthy of action. Click. The next slide showed statistics from the investigation, the 40 complaints, the disparate impact by race, the pattern of enabling behavior. The investigation that followed revealed what many of us already knew but couldn't prove. One officer had received 40 complaints over 15 years. 40 times someone said, "This isn't right. This isn't fair." And 40 times the system found reasons to do nothing meaningful. Because the people complaining weren't judges or lawyers or people with power. They were defendants, witnesses, family members, people the system didn't think it needed to take seriously. She looked directly at the audience. Here's what I want you to understand. What happened to me wasn't the problem. It was a symptom of the problem. The problem was a system that allowed bias to flourish, that prioritized order over justice, that protected those in power even when they abused that power. Click. The next slide showed the reforms that had been implemented, so we pushed for change. Real change, not just cosmetic fixes, mandatory bias training, civilian oversight, body cameras, clear consequences for misconduct, a database to track patterns so no officer could fly under the radar anymore. She smiled slightly. And you know what? It's actually working. In the 4 months since these reforms were implemented, complaint rates have dropped by 60%. Not because people are complaining less, but because officers are behaving better. When you know you're being watched, when you know there will be consequences, you tend to treat people with more respect. But then her expression grew more serious. However, I'd be lying if I said this has been easy or that the battle is over. I've received hate mail. I've been called divisive, angry, a race baiter. I've been accused of playing the victim, of using my position to seek revenge, of making something out of nothing. She clicked to a slide showing some of the headlines about the incident, some supportive, others critical. Some people will never accept that what happened to me was wrong. They'll find ways to blame me for not having visible identification, for not being patient enough, for not understanding how hard security officers' jobs are. They'll perform amazing mental gymnastics to avoid confronting the simple truth that I was mistreated because of what I looked like. The audience murmured in recognition. They'd all faced similar criticism, similar dismissal of their experiences. But here's what I've learned through this process, Amara continued, her voice growing stronger. I don't need everyone to understand. I don't need everyone to agree. What I need is for the people with power, the administrators, the supervisors, the judges, the legislators, to create systems that protect people regardless of whether others understand or agree. That's what justice is. It's not about changing hearts and minds, though that's nice when it happens. It's about changing structures and policies and consequences. She clicked to a new slide showing a photo of Derek Hutchins from his therapy intake form. I want to talk about Officer Hutchins for a moment. After the hearing, he sent me a letter. Not the defensive apology from our first meeting, but something different. He wrote about his childhood, about growing up in a community where certain beliefs about certain people were just accepted as truth. He wrote about how he never thought of himself as racist because he didn't use slurs or openly hate anyone. He just had these assumptions, these shortcuts his brain took that told him who was dangerous and who wasn't, who belonged and who didn't. She looked out at the audience. His letter was genuine. I believe he's doing the work to change. But you know what? That doesn't undo what he did. His personal growth doesn't give back the dignity he took from people. His therapy sessions don't protect the next person from the next officer who has similar biases. Click. The final slide appeared, showing a quote. Justice is what love looks like in public. That's from Dr. Cornell West, Amara explained. Justice is what love looks like in public. For months, I've been thinking about what that means. I think it means that loving people, truly loving them, respecting their dignity, honoring their humanity, requires creating systems that protect them. It requires accountability. It requires being willing to speak uncomfortable truths and make unpopular decisions. She stepped away from the podium, speaking more directly to the audience now. Every single one of you in this room has power. You sit on a bench and make decisions that affect people's lives. You interpret laws, you set bail, you determine custody, you sentence defendants, and every single one of those decisions is an opportunity to ensure that justice, that public expression of love, is being served. Her voice grew passionate, but it's also an opportunity to perpetuate injustice if we're not careful. If we don't examine our own biases, if we don't question why we're quicker to believe some witnesses than others, if we don't notice patterns in who gets bail and who doesn't, who gets probation and who gets prison time. She returned to the podium. The incident that happened to me could have destroyed me. There were days when I wanted to quit, to walk away from a system that had failed to protect me in my own workplace. But I didn't quit, because I remembered why I became a judge in the first place. Click, a new slide appeared showing a photo of young Amara at her law school graduation with her mother. This is me on my law school graduation day. That woman next to me is my mother. She grew up in the segregated South, was denied education and opportunities because of the color of her skin, faced violence and intimidation when she fought for her rights, but she never gave up. She marched, she protested, she voted, she raised her children to believe they could be anything they wanted to be. Amara's voice caught with emotion. My mother didn't have the opportunity to become a judge, but she made it possible for me to become one, and I owe it to her, to all the people who fought before me, to use this position not just to dispense justice from behind a bench, but to fight for justice in the broader system. She looked around the room. Each of you has a similar story. Each of you fought to get where you are. Each of you faced doubts and barriers and people who didn't think you belonged. And now each of you has an obligation to make sure that the next generation doesn't have to fight as hard as we did. Click. The slide changed to show the courtroom, where Amara presides. I'm back in this courtroom now, hearing cases, making rulings, doing the work I was appointed to do, and every morning when I walk through that security checkpoint, the same checkpoint where I was assaulted, I see the changes we fought for. I see body cameras on officers. I see a suggestion box for complaints.